You take a situation like Yellowstone. 90% of the elk population was wiped out by wolves in a matter of 10 years.
Wolves are making a big comeback in California. Jim and Mary Rickard say that in the last year, they've lost 16 cows to confirmed wolf attacks with 60 suspected kills.
They put it up to a vote and whether or not they were going to allow the release of wolves in Colorado.
The problem with that is people who aren't connected to it, who aren't there on the ground, they see that and they think that's the real world. That's how it is everywhere.
And so people have this perception of what wildlife is, and it's Disney and Yellowstone.
Ballot Box Biology is based on emotion. It's not based on science, and it's not based on true biology. I don't think there's a biologist anywhere that would say, yeah, let's bring in these wolves and just turn them loose and think everything's going to work out and balance itself. People are basing what they see off of a Discovery documentary or off of a visit to Yellowstone, and it's just not real life.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome 10-time elk calling champion, elk hunting legend, host of Elk 101, Corey Jacobson. Thanks for joining us, brother.
Man, Brady, thanks so much for the invite.
Oh, yeah, it's a pleasure. I like talking to hunters, and I just like talking to badasses. And so when it comes to elk, you're kind of the guy in the West, man. What motivated you, and what is it that's particular idiosyncratic about elk that has just got a fire in your belly still after all this time?
Man, it's one thing. It really comes down to one thing that makes elk, in my mind, superior, and that is the vocalization, just the ability to interact with them vocally and get inside their head and communicate with them.
Yeah, so there's different types of hunters out there, and of all the types of hunting that I enjoy the most, it's when that you get to interact with the animal. I love turkey calling, and I love elk hunting, but it's a much different game when you're trying to bring animals to you, and you're not sneaking up on them. You're not being you got to be a sneaky bastard still, but there is something that is romantic about bringing the animal in front of you. And when I listen to you call, it does sound very different than you have, like your own style, and you have kind of your, and I was wondering, how did you develop that?
Kind of like everything, trial and error. You go out and try something and it doesn't work, and then you try something and it works, and after enough times you kind of click that, hey, there's a pattern here, something's working. And I think it goes back, I've got a degree in mechanical engineering, so I'm very linear, very analytical, and break things down. And so I think that transferred into elk hunting, and just saw what was working and what wasn't. And there's a lot of beliefs out there about how to communicate with elk, but at the end of the day, I think it's more getting inside their head and understanding what trips their trigger and what makes them want to come in, whether that's their desire to fight or their desire to breed. But if you can trip one of those two triggers, that elk is a completely different animal.
Yeah. So when I was growing up turkey hunting, it was there wasn't information like there is now, but I used to sit out there all day when I had the opportunity. And in Texas, you have a lot of birds, so you get to listen to them, and you get the opportunity to hear them. Did you spend a lot of time listening to cows, listening to bulls, just being around the herds?
Yeah, I grew up in elk country. So from the time I was old enough to hunt, I could walk out our back door and be hunting deer, elk, bear, everything. But then when I got, kind of graduated college, early 20s, I started going after we'd fill our tag in September, we'd go to Yellowstone. And back in the, mid 90s, Yellowstone, the elk herd there was just incredible. It was crazy, the number of elk there. And so we'd go and just sit, like you said, on a ridge and just watch and listen. And that's really kind of where I saw, hey, normal calling doesn't work. Just going out and blowing calls doesn't communicate anything to the elk. There's tons of bulls there. They're all bugling, they're all interacting, but they aren't triggering a response. And then I saw a bull go over and start raking a tree, and other bulls came running to him. And I thought, okay, there's something in what he just did that triggered a response, and it made me start to kind of analyze what's different. He raked a tree. He didn't say anything, but recognizing that was a display of dominance. And those other bulls, when they're just bugling back and forth, they aren't necessarily trying to say anything, but that display of dominance definitely got the attention of them. And then you can translate that into actual calling, that there are ways in calling to try to display dominance or to issue a challenge.
Years ago, similar to what you were saying, years ago, I was hunting in Canada, and in Texas, it's real popular to rattle horns. And I've done that for most of my life. But when you rattle horns in Texas, you don't see people. It's a pretty tight behavior pattern. They rattle, they might rake them against a tree. But I was up in Canada and we weren't getting a response from the deer. And this guy was rattling in Alberta, which I thought was kind of crazy. And so what he did is he took a thick branch and he set it up against a tree and he just stomped it and it broke and it sounded like a shotgun going off. And I couldn't believe he did it because it was just so loud. But we almost got ran over by a buck when he did that. And I'm not the best at deer and elk at getting them to interact that way, but I found it very interesting that loud noise that you try to be somewhat quiet in the woods, but this was like a blast going off, and that triggered that deer to come in. Do you do similar things when you're chasing elk?
Yeah. So, I mean, and you mentioned it there, the noise. You don't have to be quiet. You don't want to make unnatural sounds, but especially an elk, an 800-pound animal, when they're aggressive, they're making noises. And yeah, I don't even try to sneak once they know where I'm at. My goal is to get close, though. I try to get in as close as I can and get that element of surprise. But yeah, and I think, you mentioned snapping a branch. It's going to take, if they know there's two bucks there fighting, which when you're rattling, that's what you're trying to portray. So another deer hears that. You're like, hey, there's two bucks over there fighting. And then all of a sudden he hears this loud branch break. He thinks something's getting aggressive over there, something going on. I'm going to go in and check and see what's going on. Elk are the same way. You can break branches. I take a stick all the time and rake a tree to simulate what an elk's doing when it's raking a tree with its antlers, which is a display of dominance during the rut. And when another bull basically has his dominance challenged and questioned, he's usually going to come in and at least check out and say, hey, is there a reason this guy is thinking he's tougher than me, or am I still the king of this area?
Yeah. Have you ever had an elk almost run you over or like came in and it's not one that you wanted to shoot, and they've been extremely aggressive? Have you ever been in a situation where you were threatened by one?
Never been threatened. And, they come in aggressive and they're out of their mind. They aren't thinking about danger or predators. They lose their mind. And I really think there's an uncontrolled response in them that kind of like a human. You get your buttons pushed at close proximity by the right person and you just see red and you're just, you go into fight mode. And I think elk are very similar, that if you push those buttons, they'll come running in, not thinking about anything other than defending their harem or defending their territory. So yeah, we've had them come in before, and usually 3 yards are standing there looking around, their eyes rolled back in their head, they're slobbering out their nose, and you're standing right there in the open, and they take some minute to look around and realize, oh wow, come back to their senses and realize there's danger there. But I've never felt threatened. I've never had him come in where I thought he's out of his mind and I'm in a bad situation here. But definitely I've seen them come in close with their guard completely down.
Yeah. Well, when someone spends as much time as you do in the woods, have you ever felt in danger at all by anything, like any bears, or you guys got wolves up there? Have you ever had a close encounter in which you felt uncomfortable?
Grizzly bears, brown bears are probably the only thing where I feel they're out to get you. I think a mountain lion, a black bear, a wolf, we have all those literally at our house, in our backyard. And so I'm around that all the time. Wolves are curious. They're, when they weren't hunted, especially, they were a lot more curious and not as afraid of you. But I've never felt like a wolf, once it knows what you are, is is still going to be aggressive. A black bear, I've had, sows with cubs, it'll get protective of their cubs, but they don't come looking for a fight necessarily. It's usually a reaction. A mountain lion's the only thing that, and mountain lions are the most, they don't want confrontation with humans. But if a mountain lion ever wanted to attack you, you wouldn't know it. Like, they are the ultimate predator, in my opinion. But again, never even had a situation. I've had young cats that definitely were curious and stood around a little longer, maybe came in a little closer to get a better look. But outside of grizzly bears, not really had any encounters that were scary.
Well, one of the big topics that is spoken about amongst hunters now in the West is this wolf population. And I saw in Yellowstone the last time I was there. I go up every year, and the last time I was there, I saw a lot of wolves, and I found that interesting and concerning, because as people that feel it's important to manage wildlife, now you have this outside variable that is impacting it in a way that if you're doing solely wildlife management, it can be counterproductive when you got an uncontrolled variable with the wolves, and then you try to manage population with controlled variables like hunters and permits. What's your feeling about this, and are you seeing an impact on the elk population and deer population?
Man, that's a loaded question, but yes. So you take a situation like Yellowstone. And Yellowstone, I think the Yellowstone elk herd was about 29,000 elk back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And then they planted some wolves in there. And you watch that elk population, this is a controlled environment there. There's not hunting there. It's kind of a bubble. It's just a place where it's not real life. And we watched the elk herds go from that 29,000 and drop down to, I think, 2,800. So 90% of the elk population was wiped out by wolves in a matter of, let's say 10 years. And then the wolves, they grew from whatever it was, 12, 14, something like that, to 145, 160, somewhere in there. And now there's only 2,000 elk left, and you started seeing the wolves get sick and get mange and die off. And then the elk population started to rebound. Then the wolf population came up. So there was it was very cyclical and very drastic in that cycle, but it kind of balanced out. And now I'd say, wherever the elk herds are and the wolf numbers are, hard winters are going to change that. There's going to be some dynamics there, but there's a balance. The problem with that is people who aren't connected to it, who aren't there on the ground, they see that and they think that's the real world. That's how it is everywhere. But we've encroached so much on winter grounds. There's been, so much change on the landscape as far as habitat and management of the habitat and available feed and everything. So the elk, the deer, the moose, they aren't managed the same way. They don't have the same circumstances or habitat or environment as they do in Yellowstone. So now you throw that same wolf population into places like Idaho and Montana and Wyoming, and they have that same drastic effect initially, that huge kill off, but the elk don't get to come back. The elk don't respond the same way. Hunting is such an important management tool because we're able to really micromanage and be able to say, hey, we counted elk this year, they're down 10%. We're going to have to cut tags this year. We want to keep the population in this window. And you throw wolves in there, and management became very, very challenging, to say the least. And so when we couldn't hunt wolves, when we couldn't manage wolves, but we were still hunting elk and deer, the elk numbers definitely took a huge hit. And once we started to be able to hunt wolves, then I think it came back into a little bit of a balance. The problem, though, that we're seeing now is elk are getting pushed onto private lands, onto big sections of private land, because there's more of a human presence there. The wolves aren't going to be as apt to go there in the winter and just freely kill elk. So it keeps the wolves kind of pushed out. It allows the elk to have a safe haven. But now the elk realize they're safe there. And so in a lot of places, they aren't leaving that private land. So the huntable population of elk is now drastically lower. The interference on private land from elk is considerably higher. So, they're damaging crops or getting into hay in the winter. So now, it's created a really complicated situation. But overall, yeah, the wolves definitely had an impact on the numbers of elk and deer, and especially moose in a lot of these states.
Once again, staying on topic here, a lot of what we're seeing in the Western United States in regards to wildlife management is now becoming a result of ballot measures. And so for those that don't know, in Colorado recently, there was a vote given. So if you get enough signatures, you can get something on the ballot. Some states it requires 100,000, others 500,000. And so what they did is they put it up to a vote, and whether or not they were going to allow or the release of wolves in Colorado. And so the wolves were already coming in from neighboring states, but they decided to release them. And so what you had is historically in most states, when it comes to wildlife management, you have wildlife biologists and scientists interacting and discussing how the population of whatever game is going to be managed. And now what we have is we have people in urban environments like Denver that their only interaction with wildlife is the Discovery Channel or by going to, like you said, these bubbles that like these national parks in which you don't see hunters in those areas. You don't see the impact of hunting, and the animals act very similar to, they're far more domesticated. And so people have this perception of what wildlife is, and it's Disney and Yellowstone. And then they vote to release the wolves, and we see a negative impact on the entire biological strata, and it seems like that these ballot measures are getting more prevalent. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, and that's, we're using ballots or politics to manage wildlife, and it's never going to be a good outcome. And I think, I mentioned Yellowstone's kind of a unique situation. The elk still have their migration. They still have their winter grounds. They're still able to do all the natural things. And so when you look at hunting and you say, well, hunting's the problem, if we didn't have hunting, the wolves and the elk would migrate, or they would balance just fine, and everything would work out. But because we've encroached so much on their habitat, because we've changed it so much, because of the mismanagement of the land, it's really changed what elk can do and how they survive. And they're not able to migrate. They're not able to get to the places they traditionally would, where they would be safe in the winter. And they're just sitting ducks a lot of times, where it's not fair to compare it to Yellowstone because of that. And getting rid of hunting isn't the answer. Getting rid of hunting just makes it that much, there's no money basically to manage the wildlife. And so we're leaving the wildlife to the wills of nature that has been compromised and changed by our impact on it. And so there's a lot of things to consider there, but at the end of the day, elk, deer, moose, all the ungulates, all the animals that wolves prey on are going to suffer because of it. We have to get involved, and we have to manage both the predator and prey now. And without that, you see ballot box biology is based on emotion. It's not based on science, and it's not based on true biology. I don't think there's a biologist anywhere in fish and game agencies that would say, yeah, let's bring in these wolves and just turn them loose and think everything's going to work out and balance itself. It's not going to work. And so, like you said, people are basing what they see off of a Discovery documentary or off of a visit to Yellowstone, and it's just not real life.
I think a lot of people misunderstand why wildlife management is necessary. And so when man intervened and when man became the apex predator, and then there was times in which man is overhunted and which man overpreyed upon the game. And so the cat is already out of the bag. This has already happened. We're in a post-human intervention world with wildlife. And so that's why we have to manage it. And you can't be half pregnant. Either you are or you aren't. And so we can't look at wildlife and say, now we can step out of the picture. We can't. We have roads. We have cultivation of crops. We have ranching. We have so many ways that we impact the environment that now it really is up to man to care for wildlife. And my question to you is, how do we get that message, and what is the message? I explained it as a layman. How do we explain that to people on why we have to manage wildlife so that they can understand it?
I think, there's a couple points there. One is we've messed up the environment. We've changed it, and there's no going back from that. We can do better for sure, but it's not going to get back to nature balancing nature. That nature is no longer nature as nature was. When Lewis and Clark came through the western states, when they came over the Rocky Mountains, they almost starved to death because there was no game. This was before, hunting was a thing. The natives were here and they were hunting, but they certainly in the Rocky Mountains didn't decimate populations. There was just, nature is cruel, and there's going to be swings where some years there's not very many elk left. And you couple what we have now, if there wasn't hunting to manage it, and you get a hard winter coupled with wolf population at an all-time high, coupled with elk population struggling a little bit, coupled with a lack of good feed and good habitat, combined with migration corridors that are no longer available for the elk. And it's literally possible to conceive that elk populations could get damaged to the point during that heavy winter that they would never recover. And we've seen that in northern Idaho in the Locksaw and Selway drainages, where it used to be a very robust elk herd. We had wolves, we had overpopulation of bears, we had poor habitat, we had fires, we had a really heavy winter, and it wiped out elk to the point where the Fish and Game quit doing counts up there because there was just so few elk that it wasn't even worth spending money to go and count them. They just couldn't recover and get on top of it. And it's been that way for 25 years or more. So it's that we've just changed things so much that we have to be involved. We have to be better involved in habitat. We have to be better involved in a lot of things, but management through hunting is incredibly important. And the other thing, people get really excited about seeing animals and talking about animals, but outside of hunting, there's very, very little revenue that gets added back into the management of those animals. Almost all of the revenue, almost all of the money that's used to manage through the Fish and Game agencies and otherwise comes through hunting.
Yeah, so we saw in Utah a few years ago, we had this tremendous winter, and I believe that was in the winter of 22. And what we saw is a dramatic amount of snowfall that was extremely hard on the deer population. And Utah, in the middle of the season, made the call that they were going to basically allow as many mountain lions as possible to be hunted. And they reacted really quickly, and they were able to keep the pressure off the deer from a predator standpoint. And they harvested a tremendous number of mountain lions. And now we see the deer coming back a couple years later. If you don't have management, you can't step in those situations and react. And so this is one of the challenges that face the wildlife management and us, the people that enjoy it. And this goes all the way down to your national parks, because those places are not immune to what happens in the bordering areas. And as one of the things I wanted to get from you is, what are some of the big challenges that are facing wildlife management, facing hunters? What are some of the big challenges, if you were to name two or three of them, and what can we do about them right now?
Wow, that's that's going pretty deep. But I think one big challenge is ballot box biology, so in Idaho and several states, we have a Fish and Game agency, and they are the biologists. They are the ones that are in charge of setting seasons, of doing the counts, of generating the revenue, and then using that revenue to manage wildlife. A lot of these agencies have a commission, which is made up of individuals, a lot of times appointed by a governor, and they're the ones on the ground talking to hunters. And then they come back to the agency, they make a recommendation, the agency agrees based on biology, They take and write up a proposal that goes to the legislature in the state, and the legislature has to vote on it and approve it. And so really, all wildlife management in a lot of these states is controlled by the legislature. And we know how it is when you get politics involved. It's, well, I've got a buddy who's got a bunch of land who wants this and wants that, and he donated a bunch of money to me, so I'm going to give that to him. And so we're starting to see a lot of states who are implementing regulations and things pertaining to wildlife management that aren't backed by biology, that aren't supported by agencies or commissions, that are literally a single legislator adding a rider onto an existing budget bill or something to get it passed. And then all of a sudden we're left with the aftermath of that. You look at Colorado, that prime example of wolves being introduced there. One of the biggest takeaways from that was hunters didn't show up. I forget the numbers, but it was 1 or 2%. I want to say less than 50,000 votes, maybe. And again, I don't know the numbers, but it was frighteningly slim, the margin that passed by, that if hunters would have just shown up. But I think hunters have the mentality of, I'll stand up and fight once it's here and I have to defend it, but I'm not going to get on the offensive and go out there and protect it.
Yeah, they're not proactive, they're reactive.
Right. Yep. Very much so. And I think a lot of that comes from just our personality is, I just want to live my life. Don't tell me what to do. I won't tell you what to do, and we can get along just fine. Whereas there's a lot of people out there who want to change our way of life because they're insecure about what's going on in theirs. And so we're kind of at we've been at a deficit there of people who are willing to take a stand ahead of time and protect what we have. I think we're getting better, but we still have a lot of people who won't go and vote because they think, my individual vote's not going to make a difference. One vote doesn't matter. But those people, and I always come back to that question. I forget who said it, and I certainly don't take credit for it. But if not me, then who? And I think we all need to adapt to that and be more willing to be the one. And when each of us go out and we become the one, those numbers add up. And pretty soon we're a consolidated and aligned group that has a lot more power and a lot more voice.